Welcome to the show. You're listening to Green Hell, a Vietnam War podcast. Join me as I explore the history of the Vietnam War, remember the sacrifices and experiences of those who were there, and preserve those lessons learned and paid for through blood and unimaginable human suffering. Suddenly, being in the militia was no longer just fun and games for my brothers, no longer just marches and drills with spears. Their militia unit buried its first casualty when French snipers shot a squad leader as he climbed up a flagpole to display the Viet Minh banner. Right after that incident, a messenger arrived with the news that French troops stationed in the hospital near our house were getting ready for an assault, supported with lots of tanks. The messenger told the militia unit to withdraw that night, under the cover of darkness. But the French attack came before nightfall, with airplanes and tanks strafing the Viet Minh troops' barracks near the dike. After the bombardment, French paratroopers advanced into the neighborhood from three directions, with fierce shouts of "En avant!" There was no return fire from the Viet Minh regulars, who had secretly and hastily withdrawn, leaving the militiamen to fend for themselves. That night, the Viet Minh sneaked back and opened fire on French positions. No damage was done, but the attack angered the French. The next day, they stormed back with German shepherds to search the neighborhood. The streets echoed with the furious barking of the dogs, the crunching of French boots, and the angry voices of the soldiers who were spoiling for retaliation. Duong Van Mai Elliott, from her memoirs about her two brothers first encountering combat at the Battle of Hanoi. It is October 16th, 2024. Welcome back to the show, everyone. Thanks for tuning back in. So, for anyone who is interested in further reading on the French Indochina War, I have several recommendations. The first is called The Road to Dien Bien Phu by Christopher Goscha. Goscha really goes into great detail about the political and social situation taking place in the region at the end of World War II and after the Japanese leave. In this episode, I will be drawing heavily from his book, The Road to Dien Bien Phu. Excellent read, highly recommended. Another book that I've read about the French Indochina War is called Street Without Joy by Bernard B. Fall. He is one of, if not the OG war historian of the French Indochina War. He was there in the country, embedded with the troops. He was on the ground in the jungles and documented well the specifics of the on-the-ground situation. He's a badass. His life was crazy. He wasn't afraid to be out there on the ground, but ultimately he died in 1967 from a bouncing Betty landmine while on patrol with a platoon of United States Marines. Third, I'm reading Max Hastings' Vietnam Epic Tragedy. Sir Hastings, he's a Brit. He covered the Vietnam War primarily during the United States' involvement. He's definitely a little more of a leftist than some of the other sources I've read, but he does a great job of bringing up the moral failings of all parties involved, even if he does question the U.S. and French participation in that war. Anyway, I'm just a guy doing my best to do some research and preserve the legacy of those who were there on both sides of the situation, while also preserving the accurate historical narrative as to what happened. And that's the best I can do. Okay, so back to the war in Vietnam. Last episode, we talked about the formative days of the Viet Minh. And so I want to drill down into this topic for a few minutes because I learned some things that I think are often overlooked, but pretty fascinating. So on September 2nd, 1945, Ho Chi Minh declares national independence for the whole of Vietnam, seizing the initiative and capitalizing on the fact that the Japanese had surrendered, the French had been dethroned, and Emperor Bao Dai had abdicated. Ho Chi Minh comes up on the scene with the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the DRV. All right, that's the government operating out of Hanoi in the early days, under Ho Chi Minh's leadership, but ultimately the cabinet, if you will, is primarily Viet Minh communist. I'm going to focus on Emperor Bao Dai for a second. As you'll recall, the Japanese overthrew the existing French administrative state in Indochina on March 9th, 1945. Okay? 2 days later, Emperor Bao Dai declared the independence of Vietnam in the form of a revived Empire of Vietnam. A new government was formed free of the French colonial rule for the first time in 100 years. The Japanese were still the occupying force, but they supported Emperor Bao Dai. So when the A-bomb drops and the Japanese surrender, it leaves Bao Dai's government wide open for recolonization by the French. Emperor Bao Dai sends out letters to the Allies in France imploring them to respect their independence. In a letter to Charles de Gaulle, he says, "I would ask that you understand that the only way to maintain French interests and spiritual influence in Indochina is to recognize Vietnamese independence openly and to renounce all thoughts of reestablishing French sovereignty or an administration of any kind or form here." And so, alas, the French said, "Oh, oui, you, and especially you." Rather than Bao Dai rising to the occasion on behalf of his people, he abdicated the throne on August 25th, 1945, ending the Vietnamese imperial dynasty and siding with Ho Chi Minh. So just imagine, the Emperor of Vietnam just says, "I'm out, but I'm throwing my support behind this Ho Chi Minh guy." He goes to Hanoi on August 19th, a few days prior to his abdication. He becomes the supreme advisor to Ho Chi Minh. And so when the emperor basically throws his weight behind this emerging political party and this emerging political leader, Ho Chi Minh, you got to imagine that's a pretty big deal. That's, without that endorsement, it's highly likely that the Viet Minh never ever would have gained the traction that they needed. So at that time in September 1945, patriotic sentiment gripped the people of Vietnam, and especially in the north of the country. The people rallied behind Ho Chi Minh's government, which at the time was comprised of communists and non-communists. And remember, the Viet Minh originally formed as a unifying nationalist front for all nationalist groups to consolidate under, not specifically a communist front. The Viet Minh were experts of mass marketing and communications, propaganda. The streets of Hanoi were awash with paintings of Ho. Portraits were sold and hung in people's houses. The currency was branded with Ho's face. The Voice of Vietnam radio broadcast pushed his independence speech on loop throughout the country. Ho Chi Minh cast himself as a Confucian wise man that was thoughtful, benevolent, selfless. Photo ops were carefully choreographed at schools, hospitals, state functions. Now, all this brings me to the other non-communist nationalist movements. They didn't possess the same propaganda apparatus as Ho and his Viet Minh. They just had a few independent papers that published opposition pieces. Alas, it wasn't enough. I'm bringing this up to kind of illustrate that oftentimes in history, they who control the propaganda really control how things turn out in the end. You manipulate the masses, you get enough people on board, you gain the political momentum, and you can get away with a lot of stuff. That's what it boils down to. Despite the propaganda apparatus at the disposal of the Viet Minh, the situation south of the 16th parallel was not quite as favorable to the Viet Minh. If you'll recall, when the 20,000 British troops arrived in September 1945 in Saigon, they released the French colonists being held POW by the Japanese. British General Douglas Gracey rearmed 1,500 or so French POWs, and together the French POWs, the British troops, and Japanese troops forcibly expelled the Viet Minh out of Saigon. And then as more French troops arrived in October, they steadily regained control of major metropolitan areas and then pushed up to the 16th parallel. Now, this is an important fact because what happened was, as they approached the 16th parallel, the Chinese refused to allow the French to proceed. The French POWs that were being held in the north of the country remained in prison until agreements were met. So just imagine that, like, hey, your comrades in the south are free. In fact, they're free and they're kicking, but you, the Chinese, said that you can't be free yet. That must have sucked. During this time, Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh were kind of like laying off on the communist specific propaganda. They were really amplifying the patriotism, the nationalism, the desire to rid the French and to have their own country, and they were minimizing their communist ideology. Why? Because the Chinese at the time weren't communists. In China, up north, there was a civil war that had been raging between the communists under Mao Zedong and the Chinese nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek. At that time, the political situation in China influenced directly the ability of the Viet Minh to crush the dissent in northern Vietnam and also in the southern part of Vietnam. At this time, it was very much in flux. The Viet Minh, they were able to consolidate power over several critical domains. All right. The first domain that I'm going to talk about is the bureaucracy. So at the time, the Minister of Interior was Mr. Vo Nguyen Giap, and he ordered his subordinate Viet Minh to take control of the police, purge any bad apples, but otherwise maintain the status quo. This included keeping around non-communists as long as they were loyal to the DRV and the Viet Minh. The bureaucracy was not limited to the police, but also included the administrators responsible for the normal functioning of government. Without them, you would have a non-continuity of government, right? So you control the bureaucrats, you control the continuity of government. So the Viet Minh were extremely wise to basically leave in place anybody and everybody that, as long as they didn't pose a direct threat to their rule or their, rise to power, they left them there because the government's got to run. And that's what happened. They took over essential government facilities in the north. Ho Chi Minh ordered that laboratories, hospitals, power companies, libraries, schools, and universities be obtained by the DRV. This included key technologies like radio equipment, typewriters, printing presses, ink, and paper, right? So for the bureaucracy to function back then, especially, you had to have ways to communicate between various locales, and you had to have paper, and you had to have ink, and you had to have printing presses so that you could pass decrees, send letters, record the functions of government. And by controlling all of these critical components, they further consolidated control over the critical services that any government has to maintain for it to be a functioning government. And so additionally, you have to have clandestine services if you want to be successful in gaining any kind of new government and controlling a new government and preparing for war with a major power like what they were preparing against France. The Viet Minh knew that the French were coming. They had some hope that they could negotiate, but they were like 95% certain that the French weren't going to negotiate. They did what they had to do, and that was establish a vast network of intelligence gathering personnel, okay? Even before Ho Chi Minh comes to power and declares independence, and even before the Viet Minh sink their claws into Hanoi in August of 1945, which was 1 month before they declared independence, Ho Chi Minh had been setting up networks of communist activity all throughout the region. Thailand, the coastal zones north and south of Vietnam, all throughout the 30s. There was this group called Communists International. They were a non-country specific group of commies, but they were supported heavily by the Soviets, and they were spreading the seeds of communism, setting up networks of people that were ideologically congruent so that these subversive supply lines and information networks could be established just in the general effort of spreading communism and consolidating communism in these areas. This ended up proving extremely critical because without sleeper cells, messengers, porters, people that are going to gather equipment and stockpile equipment. How are you going to coordinate guerrilla warfare? Important thing to know about any kind of fight against a major power, right? You see this in Afghanistan, you see this in Iraq, you see this in Gaza, you see this all over the place, right? You have two components, right? You have the fighters, and then you have the intelligence services that are supporting these efforts. You got to have dollars. You got to have people who know who to go to buy things. You got to have smugglers. You got to have a vast network of clandestine spies and messengers ready to go so that information can flow discreetly under the surface. This is why a lot of times, even Western countries in 2024, they will never admit this, but all intelligence services have very close ties with criminal organizations that are ideologically congruent with whatever country we're talking about here. Why, you ask? Because the criminal organizations know how to smuggle things in. They know how to buy things illegally. They already have the network established to transmit information, to get supplies, to find and buy critical equipment, and to get it where it needs to be covertly as much as possible. That's essentially what happened. These networks of communists were activated in support of Ho Chi Minh, and they weren't just Viet Minh, they weren't just Vietnamese, they were Chinese, they were Thai, Laotian. You get the idea. In addition to activating clandestine networks, right, they had to have a series of trans-Asian supply routes. It was clear to key leaders in the DRV that in order to resist the French when they came, the DRV would require significant material aid. While at the time in 1945, the Chinese were not yet under communist control, the Viet Minh were planning for the possibility that communists would gain control in China and be equipped to provide serious material aid. If you're interested in learning more specifics about any of those things that I just discussed, The Road to Dien Bien Phu by Christopher Goscha, super good, super good. Not dry, very well written, goes into great detail, easy to read, highly recommended. Now that you understand the actions taken by the DRV in the earliest days and the fact that the DRV had limited control over territory in the central and southern parts of the country, we should now talk about the nature of the territory that they did have. Goscha refers to it as the Vietnamese archipelago state, meaning that from the south to the north, there were pockets of DRV control, like islands in the sea. They were of varying size and with fluctuating lines. Toward the center of these pockets of control, there was greater control by the Viet Minh, and further towards the edges, their span of control fizzles out, and loyalty to the Viet Minh waxed and waned depending on the village. The southern pockets had less support than the central and northern pockets, yet despite the disparities, Ho Chi Minh's DRV maintained control and cohesion of the various pockets of resistance. And they did it because they had radios. Now, radios to us is low tech in 2024, but back then, portable radio equipment was relatively new. And by relatively, it'd been around for a few decades, but it wasn't like everybody and their mom could just communicate easily. You either had a radio, and if you didn't have a radio, you had to have a message, and you sent it with somebody, and they had to go on foot through the jungle, over the mountains, on the trails, and deliver it to a person who delivered it to a person through those aforementioned clandestine networks. All right, so it's a significant feat that Ho Chi Minh was able to maintain a cohesion of government. Although it wasn't geographically solid, the pockets of resistance were united across North, Central, and South. And as the war progresses, the DRV ends up maintaining and gaining more control and cohesion of these pockets of resistance. So the Democratic Republic of Vietnam divided the country into 3 separate administrative regions: the North, Central, and Southern regions. The North was called Bac Bo, Trung Bo for the center, and Nam Bo for the south. Quoting now from Christopher Goscha's book, quote, Ho's people now divided them into a series of politico-military zones designated for war. Each one possessed an administrative and resistance committee in charge of running day-to-day governmental matters down to the village level by way of provincial and district committees. This hierarchy of state governance, region, zone, province, district, and village, constituted the administrative backbone through which instructions, decisions, and information flowed. All right, so again, if you'll recall, I think the last episode we talked about how the Viet Minh basically had an election. By all accounts, it was kind of a rigged election in favor of the Viet Minh. Nevertheless, they did have a constitutional democracy, or something close to one at least. And they had to tolerate that because it's not that they believed in constitutional democracy, but in order to gain the widespread support of non-communists against the impending doom that the French were going to bring when they came back, the commies were kind of like, all right, well, we'll go ahead and support constitutional democracy as our form of government for now, because we'll get the popular support that way that we need to fight the French. And as we'll see going forward over the years and as the war progresses, the constitutional democracy part of it really goes up in smoke. What replaces it is greater and greater hardcore communism. In 1946, in the North at least, and in the countrysides where they could get away with it, they really purged dissent in some of the most horrible ways. They would bury people alive. They would eviscerate people in front of the village to set an example. Just truly horrific stuff. This wasn't everywhere, and it could be just a case of, there's going to be some psychopaths in every large group of people, but you got to think, the commies were trying to gain control and stamp out any opposing nationalist groups so that they could consolidate power. As we're going to see going forward throughout the course of the French Indochina War series, the level of communist control as the war ramps up, it grows stronger and stronger until the Communist Party's delegate to the southern part of the country in the Mekong Delta, Lee Duc Tho, puts it, he says, quote, to oppose communism is tantamount to opposing the resistance. It's treason. So right now we're focusing on the 1946 time frame, but by 1949, that's the attitude. And then going forward, it just gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. So keep that in mind. For now, we're going to stick with 1946, and we're going to talk about the Battle of Hanoi. Okay, so Ho Chi Minh's DRV and the French government held some talks in March, and of this came the March Accords of 1946. And basically with it, there was an agreement between the French and the Vietnamese that the French could station 15,000 troops above the 16th parallel to replace the departing Chinese contingent. Both sides basically were okay with that in order to maintain the creation of a joint military commission in the main cities and towns until their government could come to a broader agreement on the whole situation. In and around Hanoi, the Vietnamese army had 2,500 regular troops on active duty, backed by a 10,000 strong militia. The rest of the DRV's regular army was spread around the country. Total, it numbered about 80,000 troops. The French, on the other hand, had 6,000 well-armed troops, 10,000 more troops towards the northern border. The French had Spitfire airplanes, armored vehicles, artillery, machine guns, tanks. So basically what you got is the Vietnamese people had way more people than the French did, but the French had technological superiority, and their fighting force, small though it may be, was extraordinarily well trained. trained. You gotta think, these were people who just came from World War II. Anyway, so Hanoi, there were about 200,000 residents of the city. From March through December, there's an uneasy standoff where there's French soldiers in Hanoi. They're patrolling the same streets. Imagine the Clint Eastwood glare. You know, they're smoking a cigarette, flicking it at each other's directions. The other guy spits. They're like huffing and puffing, bowing up. There might have been like fisticuffs here and there, but there were no real violent clashes. December, hits the fan. By early December, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam government ordered the evacuation of civilians to begin. If you'll recall, the naval bombardment of Haiphong by the French, and how anywhere between 2,000 and 6,000 people died during that. Everybody was like, we don't want that to happen again. We need to get the people out of here. It's going to go down. The French are coming. We need to be ready. To recap, the Vietnamese have 2,500 regular soldiers and 10,000 militiamen against the 6,000 French Expeditionary Corps. The commander of all Vietnamese forces in Hanoi was named Vuong Thua Vu, and I'm fairly certain I didn't say that super well, but from this point forward, I'm just going to call him Mr. Vu. That's the commander of Vietnamese forces in Hanoi. Okay, so by 13 December 1946, Mr. Vu has his battle plan blessed off on. They're ready to go. The militia troops would fall back to the old quarter, which was like this zone where there was a lot of shop and there was a lot of, street vendors. They were going to fall back to the old quarter while the regular army would do its best to stop the French, and they would also try to head off any reinforcements coming from the airfield nearby on the other side of the Red River. While the regular forces were doing that, the militia would exploit the fact that there's a maze of narrow streets and alleys in the old quarter, and the militia members are citizens of the city who know that area by the back of their hand. And so they would take advantage of that knowledge and the labyrinth of alleys and streets to draw the enemy into a quagmire for as long as possible before eventually falling back across the Red River themselves in retreat. This labyrinth of alleys would be ground zero for the Battle of Hanoi. As you can imagine, wherever you've got close quarters, it's intense, brutal, bloody fighting. You're going in the houses, you got to clear every house, you got it slow going, people pop out, they have spider holes in the walls. I mean, if you want to see a good example of what this kind of combat looks like right now in 2024, look up any Israeli Defense Forces combat footage of Gaza, and that's pretty much it. It's close quarters. It's not great. It's not ideal, I'll tell you that. The Vietnamese did their due diligence to make it extra difficult for the French. They had walls that were connecting one unit from another smashed out so that you could move laterally through the buildings without having to go into the street. So, people dip into a building, they're moving between units, down, popping out on the back into another street, and they're gone. They had safe houses set up, supply drops everywhere. They had people that knew the streets, kids that could run fast and squeeze into tight areas to carry messages. So they had their communications lines pre-established, they had their supply lines pre-established, and they had snipers everywhere. On December 19th, 1946, the really hits the fan, and the signal is given, and the Vietnamese attack. 2,000 fighters, men, women, and children, scurried into the interconnection of all these houses and alleys. They barricaded all the streets. From Ho Chi Minh and his inner circle, the Vietnamese general staff, from their perspective, this battle was extremely important. They needed to hold off the French for at least a month. Why? Because how do you make the case to the people of Vietnam that your country is worth a at all if it just gets steamrolled immediately by the enemy? They knew that they were going to get overrun, but they said, we got to hold it for at least 1 month. We need to show the world that the French are bullies, and we need to show our people that we can put up a fight. And they did. All right, so as the French are rolling up, and as the old adage goes, the best laid plans never survive first contact with the enemy. Well, as soon as the shooting started, many of the militia dropped guns and ran. I mean, what do you expect? These people aren't trained fighters. Once the bullets start flying, right, it's that discipline and training which steals the nerves and keeps the infantrymen in the fight. If you don't have that, and unless you're just a hardcore motherfucker, you're going to run away. It's just going to be the fight or flight instinct, and the flight kicks in, and your buddies run, then he runs, another guy runs, and all your friends are running, so now you're running, and that's just what happens. So of the 10,000, it's estimated that maybe a fifth of those actually participated in the battle. So if you think about it, that puts the force now of 2,500 regular Vietnamese soldiers and 2,000 militiamen against 6,500 crack French soldiers straight from World War II. As you might imagine, the odds were not super great in terms of pure military prowess for the Vietnamese, but like I said, the Vietnamese had home court advantage in this situation. The French moved quickly, they pushed in, they beat off any resistance, and they quickly gained control of the main routes leading into Hanoi. The French quarter came into the hands of the French, and by then, the administrative buildings of the capital, including the presidential palace, were now back under French control. Vietnamese partisans, who may or may not have had official approval by the government, slaughtered dozens of French civilians, and it's just messed up whenever groups of people just take out their rage on unarmed civilians. There were people who were sympathetic to the Vietnamese independence in that situation. Christopher Gasha names one. His name is Michael Le Herpiniere. He was a French settler. He was sympathetic to the Vietnamese, but he came to find his friends, including their young children, lying dead in pools of blood. The French had also massacred innocent civilians. 20 Vietnamese civilians, including women and children, were murdered a few days before their invasion of Hanoi. It was just perpetuating the cycle of grievance and violence. You know, French kill some Vietnamese, Vietnamese kill some French. It's always the civilians that never deserve it, but end up getting killed. The sad fact remains that the atrocities committed by both sides against unarmed civilians at the Battle of Hanoi, the prospect of peace between the French and the Vietnamese was squashed. From that point forth, this was war, total war. Both sides were hell-bent on crushing the other side. In the middle were unarmed civilians. Both French settler civilians and Vietnamese native civilians were caught in the crossfire. They were killed by the French. They were killed by the Viet Minh. Okay, anyway, so getting back on topic, as the French gained more and more control of Hanoi, they implemented martial law, set up military tribunals, and basically had anybody that they wanted to, that they considered to be a combatant, arrested, executed, or sent off to, who knows where to get interrogated or thrown into some really shitty French prison. There were a number of them. That was the situation for the Vietnamese that stuck around to fight the French. In the early days of January 1947, the French had taken control of most of the city. They didn't really have much control over the maze of streets and houses making up the old quarter. They nevertheless had the combatants isolated to that part of town. In that part of town, the old quarter of Hanoi, there were 20,000 Vietnamese civilians and 10,000 Chinese civilians. The commander-in-chief of the Expeditionary Corps in Indochina, General Jean Volet, called for the officer in charge of Hanoi to, quote, hit them hard with the cannon and the bomb in order to put an end to the resistance and to prove to our adversary the overwhelming superiority of our capabilities. However, the commander in charge of the Battle of Hanoi, General Louis Louis Constant Morlier saw things different. Rather than obliterate the old quarter at the cost of hundreds or thousands of civilians, he imposed a blockade around that zone and intentionally left a humanitarian relief corridor for people to escape. And that kind of thing still happens to this day. There are various instances where you leave a humanitarian route so that they can escape when you start imposing a blockade. It's the best way to diffuse a bad situation without killing everybody, because that's what happens otherwise. You're going to consider them combatants, and you're just going to bomb the ever-living out of those people, which is oftentimes what happens, unfortunately, in war. On 15 January 1947, a truce was brokered that allowed thousands of Chinese, Vietnamese, and British Indian nationals to evacuate the old quarter. 6,000 women, children, and elderly Vietnamese and 500 Chinese left the city. About a week later, another 3,000 Chinese and 200 more elderly and sick Vietnamese were also allowed to leave. This ceasefire allowed for a reprieve in the fighting, and therefore it gave the Viet Minh, Ho Chi Minh, and his entourage the window of opportunity to escape and flee north. About 1,000 fighters, mostly militia fighters, pretty badly armed and pretty beat down from the siege, they put up a fight until the very last minute. Over the course of the next couple weeks, militia fighters trickled down, hundreds died, some slipped away with the refugees, others just kind of escaped on their own. By February 1947, Mr. Morlier, who allowed for the humanitarian corridor, he was replaced by none other than Colonel Pierre Debay. You'll remember him as the guy who presided over the Haiphong bombing. Well, he was in charge of the Battle of Hanoi as of February, and he sent armored columns and troops to just go on through and bulldoze, bombard the ever-loving out of the old quarter. It was basically like, the people are gone, hopefully anybody who's left is a combatant, so unleash the artillery, send in the tanks, send in the armored personnel carriers, and send in the infantry, and whatever's left, if it's still standing, shoot it, bulldoze it, bomb it, we don't care, let's finish this. When it was all said and done, of Hanoi's 13,000 houses, about 2,800 were destroyed. February 18th, 1947, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam finally gave the order for all remaining militia forces to retreat across the Red River and out of Hanoi. All in all, depending on how you look at it, either the French laid siege to Hanoi or the Viet Minh bogged down the French from December 19th, 1946 to February 18th, 1947. I'm going to read a quote from Ho Chi Minh that he made on December 20th, 1946. He said, "Those who have rifles will use their rifles. Those who have swords will use their swords. Those who have no swords will use spades, hoes, or sticks. Everyone must endeavor to oppose the French colonialists and save this country." You know, I find it amusing when leaders make such comments, because you never see them out there with the hoe or the sword or the rifle. Never. Not at all. I'm going to bring up another detail which I think is pretty crazy, and that is during the Battle of Hanoi, the Vietnamese government created the Children's Guard. It consisted of 175 children, many of them orphans whose parents died during the famine of 1944 through 1945. They were guides, messengers, and scouts between an average of 8 and 14 years old. According to Gasha, over 20 children perished while serving in the Children's Guard. before the word finally came to retreat out of Hanoi, February 1947. Alright, so on that cheerful note, I'm going to wrap it up for today. A couple final closing notes. You can find me on X. Just got a new X account for this podcast. You can find me at the handle at greenhell6969. That's at sign greenhell6969. You can shoot me a message. If you have any comments, let me know. Let's see, is there anything else? Oh yeah, I'm going to drop a link to The Road to Dien Bien Phu. I'll also drop a link to Street Without Joy and Vietnam Epic Tragedy. Alright, as always, special shout out to the folk over at www.zapsplat.com who provided the sound effects that you've heard here today. Alright everybody, be free, be brave, be badass. Peace.